After a night in her hotel room listening to the sirens, the shouting, the breaking windows, the gyropters thudding overhead, and occasionally the gunshots, Lyra felt tired and oppressed. But the Smyrna ferry left that day, and she couldn't hide in the hotel forever. She went down for breakfast and then stayed in her room till it was time to check out. According to the receptionist, who had read it in the morning paper, the assassins had all been killed when the guard stormed the cathedral. The rioting since had been the work of some men from the mountains he didn't know more, exploiting the general panic. It was all over now, he told her. The civil police were in command. The hotel staff were glad to see her leave, because they were all afraid of her. She felt their alarm and dread, and since there was no point in trying to be invisible to them, she tried to dispel it by being friendly. But there was nothing she could do to acquire a daemon. She felt glad to put the place behind her and make for the port. The ferry left in the late afternoon and would arrive in Smyrna on the second morning afterwards. Lyra could have paid for a cabin, but after her temporary imprisonment in the hotel, she wanted to spend as much time as possible in the open. On the first evening, she ate by herself in the dingy restaurant, and then sat on deck, wrapped in a blanket in a comfortable wicker reclining chair, watching the lights on the shore as they went past, and the night fishing boats, and the starry sky. She was thinking about Alison Weatherfield, a teacher, a woman of clear decency and certainty, someone she would like to emulate. She reminded Lyra of Hannah Relf. The fears Alison expressed about the new High Council were like her own, though Lyra hadn't managed to think them through. Since Pan left, her focus had been entirely on her own predicament, and, no, it had begun before that, when they'd first become estranged. Probably. Self-preoccupation was not something Lyra admired in others, but here she was, thinking of nothing else. Good women like Hannah and Alison found other things to fret about, or, better still, didn't fret at all. Good women. It was so complicated. She remembered Malcolm describing the sisters in Godstow Priory, who had been so kind to him when he was a boy, and who'd taken in the baby Lyra and looked after her before the flood came. Clearly what they did was good, and equally clearly much of what the magisterium did was not. But were they part of the magisterium because of their beliefs, or something else altogether because of their activities? She thought she'd been certain about things when she came back from the north, but the things she'd learnt during her adventures there seemed so far away now. All that remained was a scatter of vivid impressions, of personalities such as Lee Scoresby and Mary Malone, and of events like the fight between the bears, and above all of the moment when she and Will kissed in the little wood in the world of the Mulefa. She'd hugged to herself the phrase "the Republic of Heaven," but never analyzed what it might mean. When she'd thought about it at all, she'd thought that rationality was the very foundation stone of the Republic of Heaven. That was the Lyra who wrote essays and passed examinations. That Lyra had enjoyed disputing with scholars and searching out the weaknesses in someone else's arguments, and cracking them open with a flourish to disclose the assumptions, the inconsistencies, the dishonesties concealed within them. That was the Lyra who had found the writing of Gottfried Brand so intoxicating, and that of Simon Talbot so disturbing. She hadn't been prepared for the revolution in her mind caused by Giorgio Brabant and his stories of the Secret Commonwealth. She would once have dismissed things like that with scorn. But now, under her blanket on the deck, watching all the little points of light in the dark sky or on the dark shore, feeling the little tremor of the engines and the constant gentle rocking as the ferry moved south over the calm sea, she wondered if she'd got everything wrong. A thought that followed naturally was that why Pan had left her. Time seemed to be suspended during that quiet night on the sea. She thought calmly and systematically back to the time of her first estrangement. From Pan, the memories came obediently out of the dark, links on a long chain. His anger when she had been unkind to a younger girl at school, against her natural inclination, and in spite of every prompting from him, mocking her inability to distinguish between the author and the narrator in a novel set for examination. An impatient word to a servant at St. Sophia's. A scoffing refusal to go to an exhibition of paintings on religious themes by the parent of a friend. her delight in seeing so much philosophy taken apart and trampled on by Gottfried Brand, her behavior, and now it all came back to her, bright with shame, her behavior towards Malcolm, when he'd been just Dr. Polstead. Small things, perhaps, but 100 of them, and they kept coming. Her daemon had seen all that, and disliked it, and then he'd had enough. She tried to defend herself against this self-summoned tribunal, but her defense was feeble, and she soon stopped pretending. She was profoundly ashamed. She had done wrong, and her wrongdoing was bound up, somehow, with a vision of the world from which the Secret Commonwealth was excluded. The stars wheeled slowly around the pole. The ferry moved steadily along the coast. From time to time, the lights of a village glimmered on the shore, their reflections shaken into 1,000 silver or gold flakes by the myriad movements of the water. Once or twice she saw a different kind of light, a glow from the fishing boats, each with a lantern in the prow, setting out their nets to catch bluefish or squid. They gave her another image. She was enticing monsters out of the darkness of herself. And she remembered what the dead child Roger, once her closest friend, had told her about the harpies in the world of the dead. They know every bad thing you've ever done, and they whisper about them to you all the time. She was getting a foretaste of that now. She wondered, did the harpies belong to the Secret Commonwealth? Was the world of the dead, the world they dwelt in, part of that? Or had she imagined it? And was her imagination just a spindrift of falsity? Well, she thought, what was the Secret Commonwealth, anyway? It was a state of being that had no place in the world of Simon Talbot or the different world of Gottfried Brand. It was quite invisible to everyday vision. If it existed at all, it was seen by the imagination, whatever that was, and not by logic. It included ghosts, fairies, gods and goddesses, nymphs, night-ghasts, devils, jack-o'-lanterns, and other such entities. They were neither well nor ill-disposed to human beings by nature, but sometimes their purposes intersected or coincided with human ones. They had a certain power over human lives, but they could be defeated too, as the Ferry of the Thames had been tricked by Malcolm when she had wanted to keep Lyra with her and not let her go. A steward came along the deck to tell those passengers still outside that the bar was shortly going to close. 2 men got up from their deck chairs and went inside. Lyra said, "Thank you," her only phrase of Anatolian. The steward nodded and passed on. She returned to her thoughts. Did the night-ghasts and fairies and jack-o'-lanterns and other citizens of the Secret Commonwealth exist only in her imagination? Was there a logical, rational, scientific explanation for such things? Or were they inaccessible to science and baffling to reason? Did they exist at all? Such things included daemons, surely. They certainly did if Brand and Talbot were right about them. Neither of those scholars would see anything wrong with a young woman who had no daemon. Alison Weatherfield, on the other hand, had seen what was different about Lyra straight away, as most people did, but unlike most people was warm in her sympathy. The loud man on the Channel ferry had seen it, and was warm in his hatred and fear. Daemons certainly existed for most people. She couldn't get any further at that point. The sky full of stars seemed dead and cold, everything in it the result of the mechanical, indifferent interactions of molecules and particles that would continue for the rest of time. Whether Lyra lived or died, whether human beings were conscious or unconscious, a vast, silent, empty indifference, all quite meaningless. Reason had brought her to this state. She had exalted reason over every other faculty. The result was now, the deepest unhappiness she had ever felt. But we shouldn't believe things, because it makes us happy to, she thought. We should believe things because they're true, and if that makes us unhappy, that's very unfortunate, but it's not the fault of reason. How do we see that things are true? They make sense. True things are more economical than false ones. Occam's razor. Things are more likely to be simple than complicated if there is an explanation that leaves out things like imagination and emotion. Then it's more likely to be true than one that includes them. But then she remembered what the Egyptians had said. Include things, don't leave them out. Look at things in their context. Include everything. She felt a little spring of hope when she remembered that. She thought on. When I believed in the jack-o'-lanterns, I saw more of them. Was that delusional? Was I making them up or seeing them? Was it rational to lift the little red fruit to Will's lips in that little sunlit wood and relive the act they'd heard Mary Malone describe, the one that had made her fall in love? Had reason ever created a poem or a symphony or a painting? If rationality can't see things like the Secret Commonwealth, it's because rationality's vision is limited. The Secret Commonwealth is there. We can't see it with rationality any more than we can weigh something with a microscope. It's the wrong sort of instrument. We need to imagine as well as measure. But then she remembered what Pan had said about her imagination, and that cruel little note in the bedroom at the Trout. Pan had left in order to look for a quality she didn't have. And dust? Where did that come in? Was it a metaphor? Was it part of the Secret Commonwealth? And the burning Dutchman? What would reason say about him? He couldn't exist. He was a delusion. She had dreamed it all. It hadn't happened. Before she could examine that question, the ferry hit something. Lyra felt the shock almost before she heard the bang and the rending sound of metal being torn, and then came a roar from the engines as the helmsman immediately signalled full astern. The ferry shuddered, lurching awkwardly like a horse refusing a jump, and as the propeller thrashed the water, Lyra heard something else, human voices crying out in pain or panic. She threw off the blanket and ran to the rail. She could see very little from where she was, amidships, so she hurried forward, having to grab the rail as the boat plunged and shook. More people were coming out to see what was happening, from the bar, from their cabins, or, like her, from sleeping places on the deck. Voices rose all around, their meaning clear whatever the language. "What's the matter? Have we run aground? I can hear a baby. Someone put a spotlight on. Look, in the water." The momentum of the vessel was still greater than the power of the screw, and it hadn't yet come to a halt. And Lyra, looking down where the last speaker was pointing, saw planks, broken wood, a lifebelt, other unidentifiable detritus from a shattered boat. And people, bodies in the water, heads, faces, arms, screaming, waving, sinking, and struggling up again. They seemed to be floating past. But it was only the ferry still moving forward. Finally, the bite of the propeller in the water overcame the forward momentum and pulled the vessel to a halt. The sound of the engines fell at once. More voices now, shouting from the deck, from the bridge. Men's voices in Anatolian, and deckhands came running to throw ropes over the side and lifebelts, and to lower a boat that swung from its davit over the deck. The scene in the water was lit by a spotlight that was being hastily rigged on the foredeck, and by the light from every window or porthole on the port side. It became clear that the ferry had run down this smaller boat, which must have been showing no lights, and that the boat was carrying a large number of passengers, far more than its size would suggest it could, because the whole side of the boat had now drifted into view, lying dead in the water, with a dozen or more men and women clinging to it. A woman kept trying to push a baby up onto it, herself sinking below the water every time she tried, and the baby was screaming and struggling, and no one helped. Lyra couldn't stop herself crying out, "Help her! Help her!" Each of the men clinging to the overturned boat was in fear for his own life, and had no strength left to help the woman. And after several attempts to get the baby safe, the woman herself sank under the surface, leaving the baby still struggling, its little voice choked with water. Lyra, like the other passengers watching, could only call out in horror and point, and finally, one of the men let go, grabbed the baby by an arm, and flung it up onto the rocking planks, before sinking himself and drifting away into the dark. By that time, the deckhands had got the lifeboat down, and while two men plied the oars, another leant over the stern and pulled the swimmers on board. Meanwhile, others had rigged a gangplank from an opening in the side of the ferry, where light spilled out over the water, showing the wrecked boat, the swimmers still struggling, and some people who were drowned already and who floated limp on the rocking water, face down. Lyra thought that if the ferry had cut the boat in two, there must be some people on the starboard side as well as on the port. She ran across the deck, which was now thronged with passengers trying to see what was happening, and found she was right. There were people in the water on that side too. Not so many, but just as desperate, and no one had seen them. They had nothing but scraps of planking to hold on to, and they were calling for help, but no one could hear them. Lyra saw an officer running down the companionway from the bridge and seized his sleeve. "Look, more people this side. They need a lifeboat here too." He shook his head, unable to understand, but she pulled his arm and pointed down. He said something short and sharp and wrenched her hand off his sleeve. His daemon, a lemur of some kind, was chittering fearfully in his ear, staring and pointing at Lyra. The man looked at Lyra with revulsion, seeing no daemon, and said something angry. "The boat," she shouted. "Lower the boat on this side. They're drowning." A deckhand heard her, looked over and saw where she was pointing, and spoke quickly to the officer, who gave a curt nod and moved away. The deckhand ran to the lifeboat and began to make the davit ready to lower it. Another man joined him. Lyra ran inside and darted down the steps 2 at a time, making for the gangway. She found a number of the rescued people already on board, huddling and shivering, and passengers and crew handing out blankets and helping those who were injured. She pushed through the crowd of those who had just come to stare and went out onto the swaying gangway to help pull the remaining victims out. They were mostly young men, but there were women and children too, people of every age. They looked as if they had come from North Africa or the Levantine countries. Their clothes were poor and thin, and although 1 or 2 clung to rucksacks or shopping bags, they had no other possessions at all. Perhaps their few things had gone down with the boat. The starboard lifeboat was on the water now, and more of the victims were being pulled to safety. Lyra helped to haul 2 young men and 5 children up onto the platform, and the last person to make it there was a very old woman, stiff with fear, being pulled along by a boy of 12 or so, who might have been her grandson. Lyra tugged him up first, and then, between them, they hauled the old woman aboard. She was shaking with cold. They were all cold, and Lyra, despite the exertion and her warm jacket, was soon shivering too. She peered out at the lapping water, scattered with wreckage and bits of clothing and unidentifiable objects that were once so important that people thought it worth carrying them away when they fled. Had they been fleeing from something? It looked like it. Lyra? She turned in alarm. It was Alison Weatherfield, warm and anxious. Lyra hadn't realized she was on the ferry. "I think they've got everyone out on this side," Lyra said. "Come and help. These sailors don't know what to do once they've got them aboard." Lyra followed her. "Where do you think these people are from?" she said. "They look like refugees." "That's exactly what they are. They're probably farmers or rose gardeners, fleeing from the mountain men." Lyra thought of the people she'd seen disembarking from the river steamer in Prague. Had they too come from this part of the world? Was this happening all over Europe? But there was no time to think about that. In the saloon, they found 60, maybe 70 people, all soaking wet, all freezing cold, the children crying, old people lying helpless, their daemons feebly clinging to their sodden clothes, and more people limped or tottered in every minute as the last survivors were pulled out of the sea. And not only survivors, the sailors had picked up a number of bodies from the water too, and the cries of their relatives as they recognized this child, that woman, made Lyra's heart turn over with sorrow. But Alison was everywhere, calling instructions to the crew, comforting a frightened mother, enfolding a baby in a blanket snatched from a passenger, calling for the ship's cook, and demanding hot drinks, hot soup, bread and cheese for the survivors, some of whom seemed to be near to starvation. Lyra followed and helped carry out her instructions, giving out blankets, picking up a baby who seemed to belong to no one and was too frightened or too shocked even to cry, and rocking it on her breast. Little by little, the chaos crystallized into a sort of rough order. Alison was the source of that. She was abrupt, she was rude, she was impatient, but everything she said was clear, and every instruction made sense. And, as well as giving the ferry passengers things to do that were obviously helpful, she radiated an air of certainty and experience. "You looking for dry clothes for that child?" she said, seeing Lyra nonplussed by her burden. "Well, yes. The woman over there in the green coat's got some. You'll have to change the child's nappy. Ever done that?" "No." "Well, it's common sense. Work it out. Get the child dry and clean and warm before you do anything else." Lyra was glad to obey, and made a creditable job of it, she thought. Once the child was washed and wrapped up warmly, she supposed he would need feeding, and began to look for something he could eat, only to be stopped by a woman with wild eyes, still wearing the sodden clothes she'd been pulled out of the sea in, who pointed at the baby and herself, sobbing with relief. Lyra handed him over, and at once the woman put him to her breast, chilly and damp though that was, and a moment later the child was sucking passionately. Then Allison called her over to help with a different problem. A girl of 5 or 6 years old, all alone, warm and dry, at least by now, and in the clothes of another and slightly bigger child, was seemingly mesmerized or frozen with horror. She could hardly move. Her mouse daemon clutched at her neck, shivering. Her eyes were focused on the middle distance, no matter what was in front of her. "Her family's all drowned," said Allison. "Her name's Aisha. She only speaks Arabic. She's in your charge now." And she turned away to deal with the sobbing little boy. Lyra nearly quailed, but the girl's frozen gaze and the terror in the eyes of her tiny daemon decided her. She crouched down beside her and took her limp and frozen hand. "Aisha," she whispered. The daemon crept down into the neck of the big sweater the girl was wearing, and Lyra thought, "Pan, you should be here. This daemon needs you. You shouldn't have left me." "Aisha Ta'ali," she said, trying to recall the Arabic vocabulary the scholars at Jordan had drilled into her so many years before. "Ta'ali," she said again, hoping it meant come. She stood, holding on to the child's all but lifeless hand, and tugged gently. The girl didn't resist, didn't obey, just seemed to float with her, as if she had no bodily presence at all. Lyra was desperate to take her away from the crying, the noise of voices raised in sorrow or desperation, the sight of the rows of dead, partly covered by blankets or sheets, away from all the confusion and distress. On the way out of the saloon, she picked up a round Turkish flatbread and a small carton of milk from the buffet. She led the child to the wicker chair she'd been half sleeping in, when the ferry had run into the other boat. It was wide enough for them both, and the blanket was still there. She laid the bread and milk on the deck beside her, and wrapped herself and the child in the blanket. She scrupulously avoided touching the little daemon, who trembled and whispered at the girl's neck, more alive, it seemed, than Aisha was. Herself. Lyra picked up the bread. "Aisha, kubs," she said. "Inti ja'ana?" She broke off a piece and offered it. Aisha didn't seem to hear or see. Lyra nibbled it herself, hoping the child would see that it was harmless, but again there was no response. "Well, I'll just hold you, and the bread's here when you need it," she whispered. "I'd tell you in Arabic, but I didn't pay enough attention to my lessons when I was little. I know you're not understanding this, but you've had enough to deal with tonight, and I won't be giving you a test on it. I just hope I can make you warm." The girl lay at Lyra's side, in her left arm, and a great coldness seemed to emanate from her frail body. Lyra tucked the blanket around her again, making sure she was covered. "Well, you're really cold, Aisha, but it's a big blanket, and you'll warm up soon. We'll warm each other up. You can go to sleep if you feel like it. Don't worry if you can't understand me. Of course, if you spoke to me, I wouldn't understand you either. We'd just have to wave our hands and pull faces. And point. We'll probably understand in the end." She nibbled another piece of the bread. "Look, if you don't take some soon, I'll have eaten it all, and that'll look very fine. Want it? Me scoffing the food they brought for you and the other people from your boat. It'd be a scandal. I'd be in all the papers, exposed as a thief and an exploiter of the dispossessed, and there'd be a picture of me looking guilty, and you looking reproachful. I'm sure this isn't helping. I just thought if I kept on whispering, 'I know. I'll sing you a song from somewhere very deep, And very far back there came the words of one nursery rhyme after another, little bits of nonsense with rhymes and tunes, and rhythms that the baby Lyra had loved without understanding them at all. She'd been somewhere warm on a lap, or in someone's arms, and the lulling words and the simple tunes were part of the warmth and the safety. And she sang them very softly to the child, pretending that Aisha was Lyra, and Lyra was... who could it have been? It must have been Alice, sharp-tongued, caustic Alice with the soft breast and the warm arms. After a few minutes she found a little chilly presence at her neck. The child's daemon was cuddling up against her, knowing no better, and it was all Lyra could do to keep her voice steady as she sang, because she herself had missed that feeling so much, so much. And presently they all fell asleep together. And she dreamed of the cat again, the daemon cat. She was entwining herself between Lyra's legs as they stood on that moonlit lawn, and the atmosphere of love and bliss was still there, but shot through now with anxiety. She had to do something. She had to go somewhere. The cat was urging her to follow, taking a few steps away, turning to look back at her, coming back and then going away again. And now she wasn't sure she was Will's daemon after all. The moonlight bleached out all the colours. This was a black and white world. She tried to follow the cat, but her legs wouldn't move. At the edge of the trees, the daemon looked back once more, and then moved away into the darkness. Lyra was overwhelmed with love and loss and sorrow, and tears ran down her sleeping cheeks. They woke to a bright morning. The sun hadn't yet appeared over the mountains, but the air was clear and clean, and the sea was as still as glass. The steady, quiet beat of the engines was the only sound, until Lyra heard the calls of seabirds too, and human voices nearby. "Aisha," she whispered, "are you awake, sweetie?" She felt a frightened little scamper. The girl's daemon had been sleeping between the two of them, and woke to find the presence of this stranger alarming. He darted back to Aisha's breast, and the girl sensed his fear and felt it too, and she drew away with a little whimper of anxiety. Lyra sat up gently and tucked the blanket around the child. It was sharply cold without it. Aisha watched her every movement, as if Lyra would murder her unless she kept guard. "Aisha, don't be scared of me," Lyra said quietly. "We've been asleep, and it's morning. Here, look, eat a bit of this bread. It's pretty stale, but it's all right." She gave the child the rest of the flatbread. Aisha took it and nibbled the edge, not daring to take her eyes off Lyra, who smiled at her. There was no smile in response, but Lyra was glad to see her unfrozen from that mesmerized horror of the night. "There's some milk too," she said. She twisted the top of the carton and tore off the tab. Aisha took it and drank, handing it back to Lyra when she'd had enough. That little reaction itself was encouraging. Lyra held it for her while Aisha ate a little more bread. She thought, sometime soon she's going to remember what happened and realize that she's lost everyone. And then what? Her mind moved over different possibilities. Aisha in the company of others like her, moving laboriously westwards in the hope of refuge, hungry, cold, robbed of the little she had. Or being taken in by a family who didn't speak her language, who treated her as a slave, who beat her and starved her, who sold her to men who would use her little body in any way they liked. Or being turned away from house after house, begging for shelter on a winter night. But people were better than that, surely. Wasn't the human race better than that? She wrapped the blanket more carefully around the little girl and held her close, turning her head away so her tears wouldn't run down onto Aisha's face. Slowly around them the ship was coming awake. Other people had been sleeping on the deck, wrapped up in blankets or huddling close together, and now they were beginning to stir, talking in quiet tones or sitting up stiffly. Aisha said something. Lyra could hardly hear her, and couldn't understand anyway, but something in the way the child was moving made it clear what she meant. And Lyra stood up and helped her up too, draping the blanket around her to keep in the warmth, and led her to a lavatory. She waited outside, still half asleep, and listened to the voices around, in the hope of hearing a word or two that she understood. Little shreds and snatches, splinters of meaning, like flying fishes appearing for a moment above the water, and then disappearing again, that was all. Then the note of the engine slowed, and the slight movement changed as the boat seemed to be turning tightly. Not again, thought Lyra. But a few moments later it began to pitch a little and lean into the turn. In the confined and overheated passageway, with no sight of the sea, Lyra began to feel a little queasy. And when Aisha came out, she took the child's hand and led her out on deck again, where the air was fresh. Aisha held her hand readily enough, and her daemon seemed more active and less fearful than he'd been in the night. He was whispering in the girl's ear, and watching Lyra all the time. Aisha murmured a word or two in response. Lyra saw a queue of people forming on the deck outside the main saloon and led Aisha to join it, hoping it was for breakfast. And so it turned out to be: fresh flatbreads and a little cheese. Lyra took some and went back to the chair, where Aisha sat huddled under the blanket, bread in one hand and cheese in the other, and nibbled steadily. Then Lyra noticed that the ferry had indeed changed direction, and was now slowing down and moving towards a harbour under the rocky hills of An Island. "I wonder where this is," she said to Aisha. The child simply stared at her, and then at the hills, the little town of white-painted houses, the fishing boats in the harbour. "Well, how's she doing?" said Alison Weatherfield, appearing suddenly beside them. "She's eating, at least," said Lyra. "What about you? Have you eaten something?" "I thought the food was for the refugees." "Well, go and buy something from the cafeteria. I'll wait here." "You won't be any use if you're hungry." Lyra did, and came back with bread and cheese for herself and a spice cake for the child. The only drink available was a sweet mint tea, which was hot at least. Every part of the vessel was crowded and noisy and alive, with voices expressing fear, curiosity, anger, and sorrow. And Lyra was grateful for it, because she was definitely less interesting than the situation they were all in, and she could pass among people without being noticed at all. When she got back to the child, she found her talking freely to Alison. Freely, but quietly, and with eyes lowered and in a monotone. Lyra tried to follow her words, but could make out very little. Perhaps Aisha spoke a dialect of Arabic different from the classical kind they taught at Jordan College. Or perhaps Lyra simply hadn't paid attention to her lessons. She offered the spice cake, and the child looked up just once as she accepted it, and then cast her eyes down again. And Lyra knew in a moment that the trust of the night was gone. And Aisha now felt the fear every human being felt for someone so mutilated as to be without a daemon. "I'm going to wash," she said to Alison, not noticing that the woman had seen Aisha's fear and the immediate sadness it had caused Lyra. When she came back, hoping she looked refreshed, she said, "Where are we? What's this place?" "One of the Greek islands. I don't know which one. The refugees will go ashore here, no doubt. I don't expect the Greeks will refuse to let them land. They'll take them to the mainland eventually, and they'll settle somewhere. What'll happen to her? I've spoken to a woman who'll look after her. We can only do so much, Lyra. There comes a point when we have to accept that other people can do more." Aisha was now finishing the spice cake, her eyes still firmly cast down. Lyra wanted to stroke her hair, but held back, not wanting to frighten her. The ferry had come to rest against a quay, and deckhands were making it fast to bollards at the bow and the stern. There was a loud clatter of chains as a gangway was lowered, and a little crowd was already gathering on the waterfront to see what had brought the ferry to their harbour. Lyra stood at the rail and watched the activity unfold, and gradually fell into a kind of trance. Perhaps she hadn't slept well, or perhaps her energy was depleted, but she found herself withdrawing little by little into a labyrinth of daydream and speculation, all involving daemons. The moment in the night when the little mouse daemon had cuddled against her, had that really happened? She was as sure of it as she could be of anything. But it was the meaning that was a mystery. Perhaps there was no meaning. That's what Simon Talbot would say. She felt a lurch of revulsion, and then she thought something else. She'd felt at the time that the poor little daemon was attracted by her warmth, the greater certainty of her adulthood, by the simple fact of her being in charge and offering comfort. Now it occurred to her that there was another interpretation. Perhaps it was the little Damon himself, who sensed a loneliness and desolation in Lyra, and came to give her comfort, not the other way round at all. And it had worked. That thought was a shock, but it convinced her. She wanted to express her gratitude, but when she turned to look at the child again, she found that it would be impossible. There was no point where they could meet and understand each other. The moment in the night was an end point, not a starting point. "Can I do anything to help?" she said to Allison, when the woman got up and lifted the child to her feet. "I've decided I should go ashore to see that they're looked after properly. I've got no authority. All I can do is boss people. But it seems to work. I'll wait for a later boat. I doubt the captain will want to lose more time than he needs to. You stay on board and gather yourself, and go on and find your Damon. That's what you need to do. If you go through Aleppo, don't leave without seeing Father Joseph at the English school. He's not hard to find, and he's a very good man. Goodbye, my dear." A brisk kiss, and she led Aisha away. The child didn't look back. Her Damon was a little bird now, of a kind that Lyra didn't recognize, and he'd probably already forgotten what he'd done in the night, though Lyra knew that she never would. She sat down in the wicker chair. In the warmth of the Aegean morning, she soon fell asleep,